Hi, this is Creaturist and this is a quick slideshow tutorial. Consider this as a sample, a very simplified sample of the techniques that I will cover in much more detail in the upcoming series of instructional videos that I am working on. The first two of which will be sponsored by CelluClay, so you'll know I'll get into a lot more detail on how to mix, apply, and do special effects with CelluClay. So let's get started. In this case, we're going to work on specifically some pumpkins, but the same technique can be applied to many different kinds of objects, from realistic to very simplified stylized designs. We're going to work with a variety of different materials, from aluminum foil to masking tape to craft paper to hot glue to acrylic paint to acrylic varnishes and even little scraps of synthetic fur. Let's get started. First, we start with a large ball of aluminum foil into which we press lines with various types of tools, in this case a butter knife or a putty knife, to draw those lines, push them in, and create those sections. I am making this tiny pumpkin look more like a decorative pumpkin, the kind you don't eat. And I am actually basing the shape more on a bell pepper at this point because I want those sections to be very visible in the final product, and adding paper mache on top of this foil will simplify the shapes and reduce some of that definition, so might as well make it more pronounced as we start. The stem that you can see here is made from a scrap piece of wire that still has its protective sleeve. You don't have to have a sleeve, it's just there because I didn't need to remove it. I fold the end of it to create more of a bigger rooting system. I poke a hole through the ball of foil once it's generally shaped, or before, and just using an awl, I poke a hole, I squeeze some hot glue in there with a hot glue gun, put the stem in, add more glue on top of the stem, and let it cool down completely. That creates a nice handle. That's why I make my stems longer than I need them, so that I can use them as a handle while I work on everything else. Once everything else is stabilized in the later steps of paper mache, I like to go back and do the stem by itself, and they blend perfectly together, of course. So yeah, you make the sections. You start with a ball of foil that's much bigger than what you think you need, because you will compact it as you work. You need to compact it actually. I sometimes use a small hammer. After my fingers are not strong enough to finish the shape, I use modeling tools, but I'll get more in detail in a future video. But this is generally the way that I shape the foil. Here's an example of the two next steps, which is adding facial features, and the next one adding masking tape. So first, for the facial features, I will poke some holes into it with a rounded shape, such as the brush handle of a round brush. And to create those eye sockets, I'll glue some beads in there. In this case, the holes are visible because I'm planning on adding a tiny piece of something else in front to create a raised iris look. But most of the time, it looks more like this. I just add a small smooth bead in there, and I will create the eyelids with paper strips later. So you create all these facial features, thinking of them as simple geometric shapes. Some complex, some more simplified, such as here's a ball for a cheek. Here's another ball, maybe an added ball there for an eyebrow if you wanted one. There isn't one right there. All we have is the eye socket as a space for the eyeballs to stick there, with hot glue, of course. So a little line of hot glue for the nostril, a little line of hot glue for the big banana shape I put for the upper lip, and same thing for the lower lip. You could add some balls for the cheeks if you want. So all this can be done on the stem as well. After which you want to cover it with masking tape to stabilize the shape, make it easier to see as well, because foil makes everything difficult to see. It's so shiny and varied as a surface. Of course, it's less varied if you hammer it properly, but it's still shiny. So once you put the masking tape, you will notice some differences. Here you see this side is much skinnier than this side, so I might decide to put another piece of foil there on top of the masking tape. It's not a problem. A bit of hot glue, and then the foil, you shape it with your hands and some tools, then you cover it as well with masking tape. At this point, you may proceed directly to the paper mache, or you may cover the masking tape with a plastic coating, such as plastic wrap from the kitchen. I like to use a biodegradable plastic wrap. It feels less wasteful to me. And I glue it down with a little bit of wood glue. You could probably use some spray glue as well. You just want to make sure that the plastic will not move around. That will enable you to eventually separate your dried papier-mâché shell from the form should you decide to make a series from the same form. So you might want to make 12 nearly identical pumpkins, for example, or something else. So you want to be able to cut your paper mache off of this shape without it ripping out entirely. So plus it makes for a much cleaner step of reassembly. So should you want to do that, then this is when you put the plastic on. Should you not want to do that, if you just want a one-of-a-kind sculpture, just proceed to the next stage, which is adding craft paper or another thin but strong paper such as coffee filters. I find coffee filters are too thin for this. If you want to save time, if you want a thick shell that's strong enough in a shorter amount of time, I recommend thin craft paper. The same kind of thinness that you would get on a lunch bag, at least in North America. Different countries might have different thicknesses of paper bags, if they even have them for the lunches. So I never take for granted that everybody in the world has access to exactly the same materials. You'll have to adapt to what is available to you. What I do recommend is that no matter the thickness of your paper, it should be thin enough to conform to your shapes, and it should be strong enough to be strong when it's wet. So wet a piece of that paper, and if you try to rip it and it's slightly difficult to rip, then it's better than a paper that will just decompose. That is why I do not use newspaper for most of my paper mache projects as the final product. I will use it sometimes to shape the shape. If it's a bigger sculpture, I'll make it mostly out of balls of newspaper covered in masking tape and then plastic wrap. So in this case, it's just craft paper, thin craft paper, about 2 coats, 2 layers. Although normally I would put 4. These have not been finished. These were made in years ago when I was still applying the layers one by one. Now I use a method that I call the pancake method, which is based on what I was told verbally from a fellow artist who learned it from a Chinese artist. But it's also a technique I have seen from some Russian companies. So it's a stacking method that allows you to apply 4 layers of paper or more at a time in one sitting instead of 1 layer at a time. So once you do that, you have 4 layers. Once you dry those, you can put another 4 layers if you plan on having a very strong item. For example, a keepsake decorative item for your holiday decorations. You want it to last many, many years. Make sure that your paper mache shell is already super strong by itself. If you add CelluClay on top of that, you'll have even stronger results, and of course you'll have total control over the texture. Here's the zoom in on one of these creatures. Again, these are all pumpkins. You can see he's very rough. All these wrinkles that you see are my fault because I decided to use bigger strips of paper. If you use smaller pieces, everything will look as smooth as this here. If you use bigger pieces, they will resist you when you try to make them conform to your shapes. So these are what I call bridges here, where the mouth is between the nostril and the cheek fold, the nasolabial fold. Those are called bridges. I call them bridges. I don't know if there are specific terms, but they create what I think looks like bridges. They reduce the definition, so I would have to go back with a craft knife and cut those off and use tiny pieces to patch those areas. Although in this case, because of the simplicity of this method, I can get away with not doing that at all. The CelluClay will hide my mistakes, my sins. You'll notice that the eyelids are starting to be formed, but they were not finished. I could do that all in CelluClay, and that's probably why I stopped there. But a lot of times when I want my eyelids, for example, to be very subtle, I will just make them out of paper strips. I'll fold a stack of 4 layers of paper, fold one end of them, and use that folded end as a nice smooth finish to create the upper eyelid. But first I'll do the lower eyelid. It's more logical that way. You do the lower eyelid, then you do the upper on top. Then you can go back later and refine it with CelluClay. You could also cover the eyeball, as I did on some of these guys, most of these guys. But when the bead is the color you want for your eyeball, it's fine, especially since you're gonna varnish it anyways later. The next stage after that is CelluClay, or another paper product. But I really like CelluClay. I've made my own mixes over the years. I always go back to CelluClay. It's less work. You have a container of compacted powder. You just grab a handful and mix it, and it's ready to go. You don't waste your time with this. So it's a very strong product. It's made from recycled paper. I really love it, so that's why I use it. At first, I must admit, I hated it because I did not understand it. But I kept going back to it, and I'm glad I did, because now it's like watercolors. Once you understand the properties of a material like watercolor or CelluClay, instead of fighting its properties, you play with them, you dance with them, and you end up with the result that you want. You're not trying to fight it. You're not trying to make it conform. You conform to it, and it's a much smarter way to work. This is about 3 or 4 applications of CelluClay that I did from leftover batches that I mixed for other projects. So this has been an ongoing, in progress work for years. I only finished it recently for the purpose of this tutorial. So I did all the painting on it because it was ready. I could have spent more time sanding it. This is barely sanded compared to my usual, but I wanted to show you what it looks like when you embrace the texture of papier-mâché instead of trying to hide the whole thing. So I used sandpaper, and I used a power sanding drum on my Fordham. Could be a Dremel as well. You can use the same products for those. Sanding drums work really well to remove the sharp pieces. When I touch my dry papier-mâché item, I make sure there are no sharp areas anywhere that could be abrasive to the skin. I want them to be pleasant to touch, especially for my puppets and masks. But decorative items as well, I would take the time to deburr them, basically. I did forget to mention that whether it's paper strips or CelluClay, you want to make sure your papier-mâché projects are being dried with proper air circulation, which is why in most places in the world I recommend using a fan. If you live in a high desert, in a dry, hot desert with wind circulation, then you don't need a fan probably, unless it's a wet desert. But in most places I recommend a fan. I use mine at the lowest setting overnight, or when I'm not working on it, I'm going to work on something else. About 8 hours is required in my type of weather. I'm in Montreal, Canada, to dry 4 layers of paper in one sitting. About 8 hours, sometimes up to 12, depending on how moist the air gets. I don't have air conditioning here, so it varies quite a bit. But, a fan will be very useful. I'll give you a reason. If you don't use a fan, the same project could take a week to dry, and within that time frame you could get mold or spores developing inside or outside your papier-mâché. But if you use a fan, it will dry overnight, and there's no way. I've never had a problem with mold or spores developing. So even when I use, and that's my main glue now, even when I use a boiled wheat paste, which is made of flour, salt, and water, so that is food for those things, and I've never had a problem because I always use a fan, so keep that in mind. So you sand it as smooth as you want it. You could proceed with a smoothing coat after that. You can make your own smoothing coat with joint compound, the ready-to-use kind, that you mix, I would say, 3 parts of joint compounds for 1 part of acrylic medium. It could be a gel or a liquid. I use a liquid these days. And it makes a very thick paste that you apply thinly and speed dry with a hairdryer, or not. I prefer to use a hairdryer. If you apply it too thick, it will crack, which can be a really great special effect if you need it. But I prefer to apply it in maybe 20 different coats that are very thin and sped dried with a hairdryer, every one of them. And if you do that carefully, you'll have a very smooth surface after, because you can sand it down to almost nothing. It will become like porcelain, so a glazed porcelain if you're really careful. So you can do that. In this case I didn't, because I wanted to show you what it looks like when you respect the texture, when you use it to your advantage. So this is what it looks like. This is a priming coat. I use the sealer right on top of the CelluClay. It's called Bullseye 123. It's from Zinsser. It's my favorite so far. I've tried different kinds of sealers over the years. One that I do not recommend is an acrylic gesso. Any acrylic gesso that I've tried so far, including the big brands such as Liquitex, they make the papier-mâché weaker. So do not use that. I will get into more detail in my future video. But just trust me on this, it feels like it's making it better, but it's not. It makes it weaker. So instead I use the bullseye 1, 2, 3, inside and out if I have access to the inside, to protect the whole paper mache from moisture even before the paint is applied. So 2 or 3 coats, sometimes 4, depending. You can dilute your primer if it's water-based with some distilled water. This is what it looks like after the next step, which is base coat colors, local colors. So you decide if the face is yellow, you paint it yellow. No gradients, no specific fidgety bits. It's just flat color application everywhere. So this takes a while, depending on how meticulous you are. You want to make sure there are no white spots. You don't want to see the primer ever after that stage. So flat colors everywhere. I'm not going to go too much in detail about this. This is what it looks like after, when you start doing when you have done the shading. Some people will stop at this point. It looks good enough for some people, but for me it's not rich enough. So I usually follow this with an antiquing, but let me talk about the highlights first. Highlights is a lighter version of the base color, just to highlight the bumps that you want to stick out more. Like pretend that the light is coming from the sun or the ceiling lights, basically from above. Where would the light hit on that sculpture? So top of the nose, top of the eyebrows, top of the eyelids, top of the inside of the eyelid. Any bump basically has a little bit of shading, but less than the pieces that I want to show out, like top of the cheeks, top of those sections on the pumpkin. So this is the shading for the highlights. Then shading with the shadows is a darker color of the main color. In this case I used an orange that was very close to the skin color here, basically in between them. And you decide what color you use for that. You could go contrasty and use an opposite color on the color wheel or something. It might be interesting. But for this I wanted to stick within the same color range mostly. So I went with an orange. It looks a bit darker here than it actually is, probably because of the shadows and the kinds of lights I used. So it's still a bit glossy because this is the paint finish without having any matte varnish on top. There's a bit of matte medium in the paint, but it still looks plasticky. So the next stage is antiquing. It will make the texture pop out. It can also help with that 3D effect. Problem is I made a mistake. I mixed my usual blend of raw umber and burnt umber, mostly burnt umber for that chocolate look, because I find it richer than just the raw umber, which is more greenish. But I made it too concentrated, and I featured the texture more than any other color. So the brown is overpowering everything, so I had to repaint it back to this stage. So that was a bit heartbreaking, but it had to be done for this tutorial to happen. And it ended up looking like this, because this time, after I repainted to this level, I did not do the antiquing in the same way. I antiqued with the same color I used for the shading of the skin, and I made a darker one for the darker version, of course. So you can still see the texture a little bit. It shows up depending on the lighting conditions. The pits are still highlighted a little, shaded with a darker color, and that makes it look richer in my opinion. I made more detailing in the eyes. I made them glossy after everything else was painted matte with a matte varnish. That did not end up being as matte as it should. It does happen. I don't understand why. But if I use an airbrush to apply the same varnish, it will look very, very matte. So I will go back to that at some point. You can see here on these angles that it's quite glossier than a real pumpkin would be. So I would go back with my airbrush and use a Liquitex matte varnish, as opposed to the Saman furniture varnish I was using recently on other projects. Apparently for this project it just didn't want to work, so I'll go back to Liquitex. I'll just spray it with the airbrush and it will work really well. I will need to reduce it with some reducer and airbrush medium, but it works really well. I've tested it on several projects. The eyes were made glossy with some nail polish. Instead of brushing it on carefully and doing several coats, I tried to do it in one coat by pouring a puddle of it and pushing it with the brush that comes with the nail polish bottle. I used Sally Hansen Mega Shine. It's not the best, probably, but it's the one I've been using over the years and it works, so that's the one I keep buying. If you have any other recommendations, please let me know. These eyes are not perfect. There's a little bit of a pebbly surface in some areas because I did have to go back and touch up some forgotten spots. It's hard to see sometimes when you're doing it. Plus, you want to avoid the varnish pouring down, you know, past the eyelids, because it's going to look like it's crying. Actually, he does look like he's crying because he's got some accumulation at the bottom, which I don't mind in this case. The hair pieces are just scrap pieces of synthetic fur on their backing. I just cut the size I wanted. I hot glued them in place. When that was stabilized, I put a fine line on the front here. Then I folded the hair back on top of the line to hide that line with the hair, and that's what it makes it look like it's almost growing out of the skin. I did that on all the surface, on all the faces of the rectangles of the backing, and that's how it looks. I messed up a little bit here. It's not perfect, but you know, I can go back later with some loose strands of this fur and put it on top. How did I get this texture on them? After it was properly glued down, I just brushed in some red oxide acrylic paint in them, and I used a comb to re-separate the hair before it dried, of course. And I posed it. I let it dry without touching it until it was dry, so it would keep that position. It's a cheaper version of hair gel, but I've used it for years on some puppets. It does get a little bit more grungy over time, but it's worth it. I think it looks more natural. You can make fake grass out of this stuff if you can find the proper length of synthetic fur for the scale of the work you're doing. So I end up with a matte varnish most of the time, and a glossy varnish for the eyes. I put a bit of glossy on his lips actually as well. If you use a lot more on lips, it's going to look like they're actually wet instead of just moist. So the shiniest bits usually are the eyes. If you're making a horn on an animal or a creature, you might need some really shiny horns. It depends on the species, but I like a contrast of texture, color, shapes, proportions, all these things. So if you have that, it makes for a more interesting character. Before I put the eyebrows, it was still okay, but I think it makes the character once you put these facial features, facial hair, piercings, earrings, whatever you use. It just adds to the story. Thank you for watching. Please look out for those instructional videos that are coming soon on this channel or elsewhere, but I'll announce it on here. And if you have any questions, please ask creaturist@gmail.com.